Well, we're back for more. After the last debate with Kassem and Scientific Snitch felt the conversation didn't really come to a resolve. She wanted another shot. So we organized another debate, and I decided to make the structure a little different. I decided to structure it a little more like a formal debate. Each participant had 10 minutes to make their first claim, and then we went into a 6-minute round, and then we went into a free-for-all. Personally, I liked this format a little bit more, and I feel like Elle really shined in the first 10 minutes. It's very clear she does a lot better when she's able to script her responses. And so I felt like that gave her an upper hand. But this conversation definitely got a lot more heated than the last one. So once again, the call is yours. Who won? Who was right? And how did I do as a moderator? Let's get into it. I will start the clock as soon as Elle, you are ready to go.
I sent a request over to share.
Okay, let me just get my stopwatch ready to go. And go.
All right, so according to our last discussion at timestamp 21:27, you say, and I quote, a muscle either crosses a joint or it doesn't. I believe that this statement lacks nuance and is grossly oversimplified, so in light of clarifying my stance, correcting a few of your mistakes, and also asking a few questions, let's begin. Unfortunately, the meaning of a muscle crossing a joint is not well defined by the literature in any means. Characterizing muscles can be easy or arbitrary and complex. For example, it's easy to understand how the brachialis, as seen over here, um, how the brachialis can cross the elbow joint. The brachialis attaches to the two bones that primarily articulate the elbow joint, and it primarily moves the elbow. But things become more complex when you bring in other muscles that span the joints. They move differently. For example, the rectus femoris moves the hip and the knee, but doesn't attach to the femur in any place, despite the femur being one of the two bones that articulate both the hip and the knee joint. And then things become even more complicated when you consider more considerations. For example, the articularis genu is a muscle that doesn't insert on the tibia, so the muscle doesn't even technically cross the entirety of the knee joint like the quads do, but it's still considered to cross the knee joint by Google standards, and the articularis genu plays a pretty crucial role in facilitating knee extension. Next thing is there's even more considerations actually. So similar to the lats, the serratus posterior superior does not attach to the sternum nor the clavicle, is not considered to cross the sternoclavicular joint by Google standards, quote unquote. And this muscle can look like it crosses the sternoclavicular joint from certain perspectives, just like the lat. But because the serratus posterior superior doesn't move the shoulder girdle, it has no impact on the sternoclavicular joint. So after all this, I hope you can finally acknowledge that the human body has a little more nuance than just muscles either cross joints or they don't. Now, I was taught by my professors that a muscle crosses a joint if it primarily exerts a strong and direct influence on that joint. If the muscle happens to span the joint, that only further solidifies the consideration, but because muscles can span joints in different ways, it shouldn't be considered the defining feature or some sort of really important term. Moreover, I was taught that muscles can either move joints indirectly that muscles can still move joints indirectly through joint rhythm. So while no definition is perfect, I believe that this definition accounts for a good number of exceptions like articularis genu and also helps us consider joint rhythm. Now, what is joint rhythm and why consider it? Well, joint rhythm is the coordinated movement between two joints, a joint moving another joint. To explain the relevance of this using a less controversial example, the biceps brachii inserts on the radius, influences supination, and rotates the radius. Through radio-ulnar rhythm, the distal radio-ulnar joint on the wrist also rotates at the same time through a combination of the biceps brachii, primarily the supinator, other muscles, and ligaments. If muscles only ever directly acted on and crossed joints and we correlated those two together, then we would find ourselves saying the biceps brachii crosses the wrist joint and directly acts on the distal radio-ulnar joint. That makes no sense. That's why we acknowledge joint rhythm and the muscles that can indirectly move joints through complex interactions. Now, going back to the lat topic, there is coordinated movement between the scapula and the humerus called scapulohumeral rhythm, where every 2 degrees of humeral elevation, the scapula moves approximately 1 degree. And there's not really much you can do about this kind of movement because it's not something you fully control. Scapulohumeral rhythm is facilitated by both the ligaments around each joint and the multiple muscles that participate throughout the entirety of the movement. So when determining the leverage of the lats in respect to the sternoclavicular joint, scapulohumeral rhythm must be considered with anatomical variation and correct system assumptions, as all these variables can affect how much leverage the lats actually have. So that brings me to anatomical variation. The majority of the population have lats which have very few fibers, if no fibers, attached to the scapula. I believe that's 2C. So if the humerus is the primary bone being moved by the latissimus dorsi, if not the only bone being moved, then most, if not all, of the scapular movement that occurs during lat exercises is due to scapulohumeral rhythm, the coordinated movement between the scapula and the humerus. And you cannot just fully control that with the latissimus dorsi. So why does all of this matter? Well, one of your largest arguments for the lat's ability to be biased comes down to moment arms. Unfortunately, you drew your internal moment arm incorrectly. So first, according to your post and email to my question, you drew an arbitrary line from the lat's line of pull to the sternoclavicular joint, skipping over all the other joints that still move during lat exercises. Now, sadly, unlike the gray areas and subjectivity involved in determining arbitrary anatomical definitions or whether or not an EMG study is clinically relevant, due to the large margin of error, math is math. It's either correct or it's incorrect. And the moment I realized you just drew a perpendicular line from the line of pull, I knew it was wrong. However, I also know myself enough to know that I know when something is above me. So I'm no expert or in physics or complicated biomechanics, so I asked people who are. I prefer not to say these professors' names publicly to avoid breaking university social media policies, but that being said, I can show you the screenshots of these emails as evidence of the conversations, and I just want to quote two quotes out loud. Yes, all of these force vector drawings are incorrect, and multi-segmental dynamics are much more complex than drawing perpendicular distances. So the perpendicular distances you drew on a multi-segmental system. Now, through our conversations, they pointed out, oh, sorry, did you raise your hand? Oh, 5 minutes. Now, through our conversations, they pointed me in the direction of multiple papers on the topic of internal moment arms for complex systems like the shoulder girdle. After reading through them, the way you calculated the moment arm is objectively incorrect because you did not account for reaction forces, the coupling effect, and a few other variables that are way too complicated for this conversation. In fact, the way you drew the moment arm would quite literally assume that the sternoclavicular joint is the only shoulder joint in the shoulder girdle moving during lat exercises. This is easily disproved. To everybody at home, please mimic the action of a full lat pull down or row. You can even do it in front of a mirror or a camera to verify that your scapula is moving, but just by doing the general movement, you'll find that your upper arm or humerus will always be moving during these exercises, and your scapula will also move, no matter how you do your lat pull down or row, so long as you get a half decent range of motion. So if there are multiple joints moving, which there are, then you objectively need to account for reaction forces, the coupling effect, and all of those other complicated variables. Otherwise, it's incorrect. To make matters worse, based on the paper that you mentioned that mentioned the original model and the only publication that your specific model was referred to, this model does not appear to have been tested enough to say that this model accurately represents the interaction between the latissimus dorsi and the sternoclavicular joint, let alone all of the complexities of the shoulder girdle, the coordination between the many other muscles during scapulohumeral rhythm, and specifically lat exercises. Ultimately, if you ask the authors in both of these papers, I could almost guarantee you that they would tell you that you extrapolated way too much from this model and used it incorrectly. Again, you can draw subjective conclusions across multiple EMG papers about whether or not they're clinically relevant or not, due to the vast margin of error between all of these different studies. But math is math. Limitations to a model are limitations. You can't really subjectively twist a model to be what you want it to be when it's not. So, based off of everything I've read, the farther a muscle of interest is from the joint of interest in a multi-joint system where there are multiple joints in between the muscle and joint of interest, the combination of other muscles contributing to force production and reaction forces at the joints in between the joints of interest and the initial joint are likely to reduce the muscle of interest's capacity to produce force at the farther joint. So the internal moment arm relating the latissimus dorsi to the sternoclavicular joint is likely to be small if non-existent when you do your math correctly. After all of this, my question to you would be, how can you stand by your claims so strongly and say that my claims are dishonest when you did your math wrong? You used your model incorrectly, and so the only evidence you really have now is your subjective opinion that the EMG data is clinically relevant, despite it not appearing to be clinically relevant when compared to other muscles on the shoulder girdle like the delts, which are not only found to be markedly literally active or literally not active, depending on the segment of the delt being looked at during different exercises, but the delts also happen to be supported by correct internal moment arm data, all unlike the lats, which do not show some drastic differences that would otherwise suggest that they are clinically relevant in regards to the activation of different segments of the lats. And I rest my case there. Whew.
Well
You're
done.
right. You're second.
Yeah, sorry. I have like my acromioclavicular joint has been hurting since like 2 days ago.
You have a minute and 45 seconds left. You want to keep going?
Um, no, I think that's like that pretty much summarizes my
Okay.
initial all that.
Okay. Cass, would you like some prep time to prepare your next claim?
No, I don't think so. I think we
All
can
right.
just roll.
Okay. Can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Oh, sure. Of course. Sorry.
You're good. All right. Cass, your time starts now.
Just make sure you give me permissions because I'll turn something on eventually as well.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and just hang on. I'll make you host, and your time will start now.
Okay, so just responding to the crossing point, We probably should have defined context a little bit better there. So there's a physical crossing, but we can talk about actions that go across joints. If we're talking about that, yes, we can get into a more complex system. In the context that we were having for the conversation, the more, we'll say, physical crossing seem to be the most relevant context. And so a muscle either physically crosses or doesn't. Now, when we talk about reaction forces, ground reaction forces and stuff, we can talk all sorts of indirect things. For instance, the glutes can extend the knee if the foot is on the ground. That's a separate context than when we're kind of focusing on isolated on the muscle. We can agree to disagree on whether or not, which context was more relevant to the conversation. But in principle, in our conversation, we were discussing like, well, can a muscle act on just one joint in isolation? And my argument is that, well, to act on one joint in isolation, you need the complexity of the rest of the system. Just like in order for the glute to extend the knee, it needs the ground contact forces with that. So in order to quote unquote have the crossing multiple joints that it doesn't physically cross effect, we do have to have other external factors acting or constraints. Like we have to talk about the whole system working together. So when we're talking about a muscle in isolation, I tend to look at that more as like, all right, let's talk about this muscle in isolation versus, okay, what's going on in the complex system. I don't know how to respond to Google standards, so I'm just going to bypass that. Like whatever Google says, I don't use that as a rule of law or a standard for anything. Scapular humeral rhythm is absolutely relevant, and how we would model that would be you would have to model every single position, unique to the force vectors and everything, because the rhythm is positional and force dependent. So yes, scapular humeral rhythm is part of a complete model. It doesn't necessarily change what we were talking about though. So I do agree with what your professor says, or what you said. I can't remember exactly, but like that some of these forces are way too complicated for this conversation. And that's probably where I should go ahead and share my screen here. All right. So I should have moved this first. Okay. So here's the thing that I sent you, right? So this is a very simple model of looking, or a very simple calculation of a moment arm, right? Like this is the engineering look of a very simple moment arm. So this is assuming that we're looking at one thing in isolation. We're not looking at the complex system. We're looking at, okay, point of application, estimated line or pull or line of action, axis of rotation. What is that, right? Now, does this represent everything? Absolutely not. How accurate is this? Well, this in the Brown study that you used, the EMG, when they did the calculations, this is essentially a representation of the lines of action that the Brown study found. They had a 48-degree difference. They thought this was adequate enough for what they were trying to present in that study. Here was my eyeballing it estimate relative to the Brown paper for the lower lats, right? So just context of like, okay, this was accepted in that research study, which you referenced. This was my eyeball estimate when we're talking about just the context of how the lats are acting, right? And that's extrapolated from their paper. Here's the graph, right? Or the chart here to see it, right? So there would be L1, there would be L6, right? So I'm using this simplified version, of biomechanics, right? When we start looking at this complex stuff, like for example, one of the papers that you use, you can see that in the illustration that they use, they even leave like the human body and they're just using mechanical model because yeah, the math for this stuff gets very, very, complex. So if you're asking me to try to summarize the relationship between two things, especially in the context of the conversation, I'm going to use a simple explanation when there's such a huge difference like we're talking. So if we look at a simplified difference between shoulder extension, adduction at the glenohumeral joint, which is going to be, at absolute maximum, a 6 centimeter moment arm. And then we look at the potential for the sternoclavicular action, which is, maybe a 15 centimeter, right? Like that magnitude is easily, we can represent that relatively with simple models, even though they're not going to be 100% accurate. And as you said, you'd be out of your element. I would also be somewhat out of my element trying to do this math to talk about a pull down, right? And we're talking about everything that's going on, right? So, when you look at this and you look at these complex models, here you can see the difference between these models and this is like the latest, greatest 2016 trying to account for every inverse dynamic, et cetera. Like, cool, right? you still see there's like, okay, there's a certain amount of variation, somewhat of a correlation between some of these different things. But yeah, that is a process where, you know, okay, that's just, we need data that doesn't exist. In order for me to deliver that type of model for you, I would need all sorts of real-time force data. I would need all sorts of volume numbers. I would need, not just activation, but actual recruitment and all the fiber forces and every force vector for every position in every plane of motion. So, I mean, this is like 10% of the information. Like, okay, look, the lat pulls down, that pulls down on the humerus. Okay, we have a shearing force, we have a force, then we get some subscapularis force in there. There's rotation on the scapula. Teres has a rotation, rhomboid has a rotation. Oh, the traps are also going to come in, especially at the bottom. They're going to resist the depression when we're reaching that end range, which means the lats are now going to be working in isometric against the upper traps. That's why you see the upper traps contract when people get towards the bottom of the pull down, because it's stopping that. So then more of the force is relative to the glenohumeral action at the bottom there to help finish extending in the shoulder, while we basically get to an isometric depression or retraction position, etc. There's so many things going on here. This is awesome. It's cool. Uh, it's beyond what I would say is reasonable for trying to just discuss the relationship between two things that are very different. And to kind of put that into perspective, let's just look at something like an external moment arm for a stiff-legged deadlift. Uh, Everybody that's done this knows the relationship of like, yeah, as you hinge over, as the weight moves away from the hips, it gets heavier or feels heavier, right? And as you stand up, it gets less. Now, this little model that I'm showing you, this isn't even correct. I do it straight down from the weights. It's not, it's a simple model. It's not even correct. But because there's a significant difference, we can use simple models to kind of explain these things. So if you are under the illusion that my single little like engineering style moment arm was a representative of all of the mechanics for the entire shoulder, and then this would include spinal and everything. Well, I just don't know how you can make that extrapolation. So if you want to say that, hey, biomechanics is way more complex than that, I 100% agree with you. Where I disagree is that, okay, we can look at simple estimations in areas where there's a huge difference to kind of understand or at least guess how this stuff would work. Principally, we do this in applying biomechanics to exercise all the time, because you know what? Those complex models, they don't really exist for anything. I like find one for any exercise in the gym for me. Find one. Okay. I mean, so yes, we are working on rough estimations. How rough of an estimation we're willing to accept, I think just kind of depends on the degree of difference that we're kind of trying to compare. Clearly, we can't look at extreme nuances. The same applies to using something like OpenSim, etc. Right? Like, yeah, I was very clear. This is not a perfect model by any means. It's got limitations, but I also know that if I would have drawn something or I would have used some rubber bands to kind of show this representatively, that there would have been an objection. So I was just trying to present the least objectionable portion of evidence and something that I think is different enough that we can discuss the relative differences. Right now, we also measure things in on live humans and approximate stuff. That's why length change and stuff like that is also another proxy that we can use, because the greater a muscle's length changes over range of motion, the more of more of an internal moment that there's going to be. So we can literally try and use real humans and measure things, right? I only got 1 minute left, so let me just check. Oh, you said math is math. Yes, math is math. But in order for math to be math, you actually have to have the data to put into the equation. To do a complex model like that, you need data that we simply don't have access to, right? And it would be very individual, but also the differences would be relatively small. Principally, things would not change. There's no human being where their glenohumeral joint is going to have a bigger internal moment arm for the lats than the sternoclavicular.
All right, so I just pulled up the moment arm thing that you're looking at,
Hang
and
on,
I wanted to.
hang on, hang
Oh,
on, hang on. So I can give you a few minutes for prep time, and then when you're ready, I can start your 6 minutes, and then we'll do the next round.
mm.
I should play some elevator music.
Sorry, I'm just reading through some of the stuff that you
No, you're
just.
fine. I'll give you 90 more seconds.
All right. Is it all right if I quickly share my screen?
Yes. Would you like your time to start now?
Yeah, sure. So
Ready to, okay, 6 minutes.
just because moment arms are accepted in a study on EMG and activation doesn't mean it's clinically relevant to the conversation we're actually talking about, which is that is it clinically relevant? Can the lats be biased to a clinically relevant extent to the point where if you don't do these specific exercises, your upper versus your lower lat is going to grow disproportionately more, and vice versa, like that. And that's like the clinical relevance that I'm looking for, which I don't see from this. Because when we're trying to extrapolate from that study, the oversimplified moment arm that doesn't account for scapulohumeral rhythm, that's not clinically applicable to what we're actually talking about, which is when the entire shoulder girdle is moving during a lat pull down or a lat row. Now, you can call a moment arm Steve, you can call a moment arm whatever, but if we're trying to look at the relationship and the leverage between the I guess joint A and joint B being on the cow's butt, you're still going to have to account for the reaction forces and all the other muscles in between, especially if you're trying to draw the conclusion that you can bias them based off of leverage. If we actually did the math correctly, more than likely the moment arm would be much smaller because you're distributing the force production across all of those other joints and all of those other muscles which contribute to force production. So saying that the lats could potentially clinically relevantly move the sternoclavicular joint is definitely over extrapolating that study, and it's not taking it into account for what it was, which is it was an oversimplification. It wasn't meant to be used in that way. So in a similar way where you're like getting on me for like using the conclusion the wrong way, which honestly I don't really understand why you're so upset about that, because clinical relevance is a little bit different from statistical significance. And when you have a large margin of error between different data sets, it is relevant to bring up other studies and other muscles so long as you can actually demonstrate, okay, this is suggesting that it's clinically relevant. And just to show you again, like for example, the EMG data for the latissimus dorsi is not as significant. There is a large margin of error, and this is from one of the studies that I believe was actually using your model. And then there was also, if you're looking at reading across the literature between different muscles, even though the lats aren't necessarily the rec fem or the delts, you see drastic differences. You see a consistency throughout the literature, which I don't see with the lats. Even though there are differences, the effect size isn't as great. It isn't on or off. It isn't as black and white as you make it out to be, and the leverage data doesn't line up. And so if you're actually looking at it through the correct standpoint, which it would be, you would have to look at it as a whole system. As the glenohumeral joint is moving, the scapula will also move, and you have to consider that. If you're just drawing an arbitrary line, again, you are making the assumption that the glenohumeral joint and the humerus are not moving throughout an entire lat exercise, and you can do this. My humerus is clearly moving. If I do this, my humerus is clearly moving. So I mean, you're arguing kind of like, oh, it's too nuanced, it's too semantic. It's not semantic when we're talking about a whole movement that does involve joint rhythm, that is more complex. It's not just, oh yeah, you have maybe an antagonist muscle stabilizing the joint like you do with the hip joint while the other joints are moving. That's a lot different than what we're looking at here, where there is literal joint rhythm. So
Okay. Cass, would you like some prep time for your 6 minutes?
Does she still have time?
She still has time. She's got 2 minutes and
Um,
30 seconds left.
can I just ask her a question that she can use in her time then?
go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah. So, you say you don't consider the moment arms clinically relevant, as if you have another estimation of the moment arms that you're basing that on. Um,
So
I would love to see a representation of what you think these leverages are. Have you even attempted to try and conceptualize that, or is it just mine because they don't fit this, therefore incorrect, and because you can say there's other joints involved, then that just makes it invalid.
So, as I said, force production would be distributed across those other joints. And not only that, but you also have other muscles contributing to force production. So, drawing that the moment arm the way that you did makes the assumption that the other joints are not moving, makes the assumption that there's no other muscles involved in the movement. Now, I am not a biomechanist expert, which is why I levied like a little bit of help from peers as well as professors to look more into this, because I have a basic understanding of like moment arm math, and I also understood what reaction forces were. So I did have like a very baseline understanding of this. I just dove in a little bit deeper, and the way that you did calculate the moment arm, this like these two papers clearly outlined that the way that you calculated the moment arm specifically to find the leverage of the lats in relation to the sternoclavicular joint was incorrect. And I could like quote things here if you really wanted me to, but the entire idea is you have to account for the coupling effect. You have to account for reaction forces when there's multiple joints and multiple muscles involved.
Have
Otherwise,
you
you're not
done
going to,
any of that?
as I said, I'm not a biomechanist,
Okay,
and
so my
clearly,
question is, how do you know if you did that, that it would change the relative outcome?
because as I said, if you have multiple joints, then the force is going to be distributed across those multiple joints, and you're going to have a smaller moment arm. Not to mention, there's other muscles involved that are going to be
How much smaller?
production. As I said, I'm not a biomechanist. You want
So
to do
you're applying clinical significance when you don't know the magnitude
and
that
you
of
did the
effect that's
math
going to have.
wrong.
So, well,
And
I
you did
did
the
a,
math
okay,
wrong.
if you want to go through those papers, they describe the math that I used in exactly the context that I used it,
No, it didn't.
right? So, because in my model, yes, I'm applying an isolation to just the sternocleidomastoid joint as if the shoulder is as if the scapulohumeral structure is a rigid complex, because that's what you have to do to look at it in that one simplified view in
But
one position.
that's not how the shoulder
That
joint is
is
moving in the
not
lat
how
pull
real
down.
world biomechanics work, correct?
Well, that's not
Right?
how the lat
But,
pull down works either. So this whole entire argument of leverages is arbitrary. You're just drawing.
but what we're doing is we're trying to provide an estimation that's good enough for the context that we're
This
discussing.
is not
And
good
I'm
enough.
asking if you have evidence to show that it's not.
Yes, I did. And I quite literally showed you the papers that were saying that if coupling moment arms are not omitted, the estimation problem can, in certain cases, be infeasible.
In certain cases can
In
be
this case,
infeasible.
it would be
In
infeasible.
this case, well,
See
what is your
how many
evidence that
joints
it
are
is in
in.
this case?
Okay, so are you telling me that the
Okay,
glenohumeral
I'm gonna stop both of
Yeah.
you. I'm gonna stop
Okay.
both of you. L, you have one more minute. Cass,
I'll be quiet.
Deducted 45 seconds from your talk time. L, would you
Okay.
like to have your final minute?
Sure.
Okay.
So no matter which way you slice it, the humerus is moving during a lat pull down and a lat row. Therefore, you cannot just throw away the glenohumeral joint and the humerus moving just for the sake of simplifying the model. That's just incorrect math. I said like 20 times, I'm no expert biomechanist. I'm not going to do all that math. That said, based off of what I know about it, the farther away a joint is with multiple joints in between and multiple muscles contributing to force production, that the amount of force that the latissimus dorsi is realistically going to contribute to that far away joint is very minimal, if not any. And that's literally how this complicated biomechanics works. I'm not smart enough to do all of the math there. That being said, I'm also smart enough to understand the logic of the actual system here. And like Newton's third law, every reaction has an equal and opposite action. And you also have to understand that you can't just draw lines and ignore joints just because you want to simplify the system. That's just wrong.
Okay. Cass, do you need some prep time or would you like to start?
Um, let's just go ahead and start.
Okay. You got 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh,
I'm
wait.
not going to waste
L, real quick. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, so sorry.
You're good. All right. You're good.
I'm not going to waste a lot of time trying to debate your professors through you. That just doesn't seem like that's a reasonable approach based off of how the conversation has gone so far, right? And I don't think you can say I can't do the math, but I know the math would say this. You either need to have attempted or something to be able to do that, because I can do a little bit of the math, not all, because again, you don't have the data. And also, this is out of my scope to be able to do an analysis that complex as well. But my opinion is that it's not going to change the relative outcome to the point where we would have a different conclusion that the lower lats don't have different leverage than the upper lats in terms of things like depression and retraction, or in terms of their relationship between how much leverage they have at the glenohumeral joint versus the sternoclavicular joint, right? So I'm just going to not engage in that anymore. If you want to, I would be happy to talk to one of your professors, or we can get somebody that works in these models and do a conversation with them. Um, and actually look at that, right? Because there's no point in us arguing about basically a thing that is beyond both of our approach. My stance is essentially that the simple look at this is enough to principally talk about the relationships of those things. And I know I have direct quotes of you discussing the leverage of these muscles. Like, for example, when you talked about the scapula, you said basically by them not having it, you made claims on what then the leverage the medial lats would or wouldn't have, right? And I'm guessing you didn't run inverse kinematics to make that generalized or simple claim of how the leverage would change. Okay, so we're talking relative to the context that we're in. Anyway, um, and I'm not saying I disagree with you disagreeing with, or I'm not upset about you disagreeing with conclusions. I would just like explanations when you choose to only go with one portion of the data and go against the conclusion. I think there should be an explanation for that, okay, rather than just being like, hey, I'm just only going to show this one piece of data and pretend that's all the study says. Okay. And I'm also not saying that this stuff is too nuanced. I'm saying that I think the difference between the most nuanced look at this and the simple look, I think the magnitude of difference between these is such that if we applied all the nuances, it would not change the conclusion. I think if we tried to calculate all of the forces at every joint, we're still not going to come up with a scenario where force from the lat exerts a greater force at the glenohumeral joint than it would at the sternoclavicular joint, even transferred through all of the other joints. Okay. I just think the magnitude is big enough for that. Right. And I don't have enough time to kind of go through my evidence. So I would ask, can I stop this one short and have it added to the other one so that I can actually have time to go through something?
So as we discussed in our email, you both have 10 minutes and then you both have 6 minutes and then it's just free for all for the remainder of the hour.
How many rounds do I have left?
This is your only round.
Oh, okay. So it's free for all after this. Well, fuck. I will
Yes.
just get through whatever I can. Um,
Okay. I'm going to resume your
all right.
time.
So I think perhaps am I go rolling here? Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. All right. So I think perhaps the best thing I can do at this point is actually, since we stopped before I got a chance to summarize my position, to just do that as fast as I can. So summarizing all of the EMG evidence on differentiation. Okay, I looked at a couple studies. I even found one just the other day that actually concluded the opposite. So I went ahead and throw that in there. I sent that to you as well, right? So basically, but they were basically looking just at the best way to do an MVC. So if you want to pause this, that people can read the disclaimer below. But essentially, these studies all concluded positive for differentiation. I put some limitations here because this is not the way I like to cover studies. I like to cover them in depth rather than this kind of, quick overview, but this is all I have time for. So if we look at the trend, right, in studies that included depression, okay, basically we see this trend where basically the more type of depression action, the more lower lats that are involved. Okay, in some of these, that's not statistically significant, but it shows the trend. In others, it's very past the statistically significant marker. Okay. And they're in things that are not just, like manual isometrics and stuff like that. Right. So here's an example of, okay, if we're doing abduction down by the arm where we're not really depressing the humerus, we're just pulling in, we see the same thing that we saw in the Brown study, which is a fairly even recruitment. When we have that downward pressure, you see more of the lower lats engaged. We see this consistently across here in the Kusunoki study, probably butchering that, right? Okay, in the depression task and the lateral bend task, we see more of the iliac fibers, the rib fibers, really involved in the depression task. We wouldn't expect them to be involved in the lateral bend because they don't cross. And guess what? You saw that, right? And in
Okay,
terms of
wrap it
those
up, please.
internal, am I done?
Yep.
Okay.
Can I have a few minutes?
So I can give you both prep time if you need it, and then we have 31 minutes and 32 seconds left. So,
Just a
would
few
you guys
minutes.
both like a little prep time before I start that time?
Yeah, sorry, my computer is like half dead.
Don't waste your time explaining it to me. Just use it for prep time. Cass, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, we ready?
And I am ready. Okay, so
Okay, so now this is all free for all. You guys are allowed to interrupt each other. You guys are allowed to discuss. Again, the previous rules from the last debate, if I see us going in circles, if I see us making any pointless arguments or anything that's not related to the argument, I'm going to get us back on track. So let's get started now.
all right, so based off of what you said, just I know you didn't want to discuss the math that you did incorrectly, but I think that it's important because you were trying to clinically apply math that you did incorrectly in a way that it shouldn't be clinically applied. And now it just kind of sounds like you're upset that you disagree with the math that you did incorrectly. As for the other anatomical differences that I was mentioning before, if there are only a few muscle fibers or no muscle fibers attached to the scapula, how can you realistically say that the lats play a direct role in moving the scapula without scapulohumeral rhythm taking a role, whether that's internal rotation of the humerus, adduction, or I guess shoulder extension? And are you just saying that it's like the five fibers that are half attached to the scapula that are doing that? Because that, I'm sorry, that makes no sense. And then
If
as far
something pulls down on the scapula, how does it move the arm?
so actually about I believe it's around a little over 20% of the population has no connection to the scapula.
No, I'm
So
just saying, if something moves the scapula, how does it move the arm?
um
Take the lower lats. They depress.
how
Stratus anterior,
no wait,
whatever
how
you
are they
want.
depressing if they're not attached? That's my question.
I'm just saying they attach to the scapula,
No, they
right?
don't. Not all of them.
The
But
lower
over
traps.
20% of the population doesn't have an attachment to the scapula. How are
For
you
the
saying
lower traps.
they're
I
attached?
said lower traps.
Okay, lower
Traps with a
traps.
T,
Okay, lower
right?
traps. The
Okay.
pectoralis minor, the serratus anterior.
Yes.
I don't
If a
know.
muscle pulls down on the scapula, how is that force transferred to the arm? Because we have to pull the arm down, right? The arm where we have a cable in our hand, that force has to make it all the way through somehow.
So you're saying the lats don't directly move the scapula. You're saying it's indirectly through other muscles.
Through other muscles.
Yeah, if the traps are moving the scapula down primarily, and through movement of the arm, it's also happening to, I guess, act on the lats in some sort of way or move the lats in some sort of way. That's indirect. The lats are not like there's a good portion of the population that don't even have a direct attachment, let alone there's like five fibers attached.
Yes, no, the lats, let's just assume 0% of people have a lat that attaches to the scapula, right? So it pulls on the humerus, okay? But this is a complex that is semi-rigid, right? It's not your scapula just doesn't free flow away from your humerus. It doesn't, or the clavicle, right? There's tight ligamous connections between those. There's very limited movement
Yes,
between the
scapula.
humerus and the scapula and the clavicle when we're talking about these
Yeah.
relationships of how this would be moving this way, right? We have rotation, but it's not. So the lat can apply force at the humerus
Mm-hmm.
and the whole shoulder girdle is going to move.
Yeah.
Okay. Similar to how the lower trap can apply it to the scapula and the whole shoulder is going to move. Right. Similar how the pec minor or any of these other things. Right. So I don't understand what the hang up is on being like, well, because the lats don't attach to the scapula, that means they can't do depression action. Right. Like, okay,
So
if
moving the
something
humerus.
pulls on the clavicle, does the scapula not move with it?
Yeah, so nobody's arguing that. That's
What
scapulothoracic.
are you
Sorry, that's
arguing then with
scapulohumeral
it? Like,
rhythm.
what is your point with this part of
I'm
it? Like, I
saying
don't understand it.
the lower lats specifically, the lower lats specifically are not the only thing that are involved in moving the entire shoulder girdle. The entire lat, when it contracts, is going to move the humerus. So, like, I mean, unless you really want to argue that the lower lats somehow have a mystical attachment to the scapula and is pulling the scapula down while the humerus is also moving, like, that just doesn't make sense. The entire lat's attached to the humerus. When the humerus moves, the entire shoulder girdle is going to move to an extent.
Including the scapula.
Okay, so it's
I
not
don't understand what your point is.
it's not
Yes,
directly moving.
if
That's the
it's
point.
not directly moving it, no, like it's just like it's not directly moving the clavicle. But the same thing applies to anything else that would be acting on depression is not directly moving the humerus. Like
So
these
is the lat
things.
having so does the lat have better leverage at the glenohumeral joint or better leverage at the sternoclavicular joint?
I think it has better leverage at the sternoclavicular joint because it is a semi-rigid structure. And so I think enough of that force is transferred through, right?
But
That's
it
the,
wouldn't be, not based off of the math. So, as I
well,
said
based
before,
off
the
of the
math is
math that you
correct.
can't do or represent.
Then based on the math, you can't do or represent.
So,
You haven't done
but
it correctly yet. So why
okay.
don't you come back
So,
and do it correctly?
and how would you know?
Well, because it wouldn't look like that. It would be a lot smaller. If it's being distributed across multiple
I
countries,
can do something that is accounting for a ton of joint actions and joint forces, right? And look very complex. It wouldn't come to a different conclusion though. Like, so here's like, you know what? You find somebody that you would trust to do the math, we'll get them to do the math. Deal?
didn't you say that there's not all of the variables that we have yet? Like we still need, I believe it was, we need more
You just
sensitivity.
told me to do the math. Now we can't do it because the variables aren't there,
You're the
like I
one who said
said.
you can't do it. You're the one who
So
said you can't do it. So I don't, the thing is I don't really understand what the point is. Can you do the math or can you not do the math? Do you have the variables or do you not have the variables?
can
Because
I
what
do the
I'm
math like
saying is
this in
you
those
don't know the
studies that literally nobody has done? No, probably not.
math. Okay, so there. The lats don't have a
Right?
direct
Can I guess on what it would be with a simplified model? I think so.
Not really.
Right?
When you
And
actually
that's
talk
but
to Newton's laws and how
so
force is distributed.
what is your guess? Or is it
My
just there's
guess
no
is that it
guess?
would be a lot smaller because the force would be distributed across the multiple rotating forces. As I said, you can call a moment arm speed
And that is your
whatever
guess.
you want. However, if there's multiple instantaneous rotating centers, you have
Stop.
to account for
Like,
them.
can we just not repeat the same thing over and over again? Like, we have limited time. I don't want to keep cutting you off, but I also don't want it. Like, it's in a recording. You've said you don't
It
need to read
also
the slides
appears as
over and
though
over
you're
again.
just trying to dodge the question here about you doing incorrect math. Your math
I
is
have already said that math is not representative of what is in those studies. It
and
does
what
not represent the entirety of mechanics. That is a moment arm using a simple engineering model of looking at this, right? Which is kind of what we have to do if we're trying to look at something in isolation, but those things don't exist in isolation, so you're
exactly. They
not going to
don't move
see
in
the same thing,
isolation. So
right?
why
It
are you
is a
saying that?
representation, right? That's all it is. Okay.
Okay, even if
If
it's
you have a more accurate or better
still
one,
not.
I am happy to look at it. If you can come up with a
Not that it's
strong
more accurate
reason
or look, it's
why
not that I
those
can come
other
up with a
joints
more
would
accurate one.
change it,
Look, it's not that I can come up with a more accurate one
did
because
you
as
ask your
I said, I'm
professors the
not.
premise when you asked them this? Did you ask them, is this just not good enough math? Or did you
Yes, they
actually
quite
ask
literally said
them
that.
if they
Here, I can go
thought
back to it.
so? Did they
Yes, all of
say
these
that
sports method drawings are incorrect.
did they say that the internal moment arm for the sternoclavicular joint would be smaller than the glenohumeral joint?
Oh no, that's what the papers they said sent basically implied to me, which would be that when you couple
Where?
atoms, the force would be distributed across them. And feel free to look this up on Newton's, like, just apply Newton's laws to the entire system. If force is being distributed across multiple rotating centers with other components contributing force production, you have to account for that. Otherwise, it's going to be much smaller.
I just I don't know how to kindly say that I don't think this part of the conversation can move forward. I need to talk to somebody. Let connect me with one of your professors, please. Right. Um,
You can also just
So
studies that
I'm
are.
I-
Oh,
I'm going to cut in real quick. Now we're starting to get into some circles. Okay, we're both not really moving this anywhere. I think if we want to come to a conclusion, I think we are going to have to bring in some other voices. Because I think now we're kind of getting a bit of a he said, she said on both sides. So let's move forward.
okay.
I
Um,
would like to finish my summary of the evidence and my ultimate takeaway so that you could at least comment on that since I didn't get to that last time. Would you allow me that?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, can you stop sharing your screen
Um,
now?
Yeah, sure.
okay. So I think this is where I left off on this study, just kind of summarizing that, yeah, in the vertebral fibers, which would be the upper lats here, biased towards extension task, the depression task more towards the lower portion of the lats. In the Ito study, same thing, right? So we have basically a couple different versions of hyperextension, much more upper lat, very little of the lowest portion of the lat. As soon as we get into something with a depression action, so in this instance, basically they're doing a prone version of a pull down. They had very little of the upper lat, a lot of the lower lat. Same thing here, depression with a little bit of lateral bend emphasis, tremendous amount of lower lat, very little. I know Ella's skeptical about clinical significance and like, oh, 30% isn't enough. Well, 4.9%, 78%, 80% to 20%, pretty substantial differences there. So I see that trend across all of these.
Is that above
That,
or not pull down?
what'd you say?
That movement, the M19 movement that's underneath, the depression and
the
lateral bend,
the
how is that
the
above or not pull down?
M18 is a prone pull down. So the guy has his arm on the edge and there is somebody pulling down on the feet, if that makes sense. So he's trying to do basically adduction while prone on a table with his foot stabilized. So it's, it's what similar to a pull down motion, but from a prone position, right? But and stabilized at the foot. Okay.
I was looking at the M19, the depression and lateral bend.
Oh,
I
what
don't
about it?
think
You said
Yeah,
pull
I
down.
don't think any of these movements, I mean, even the seated hyperextension, that doesn't really look to be something that you would necessarily be doing during, like, let's say a lat row, because typically you're going from a point of where you're really flexed up here all the way down to your side. You're not really going from, I guess, it's not really hyperextension the way that I learned it, because I learned it as just normal extension, but they're literally doing like formal extension there. That doesn't
Yeah,
seem
well, I mean, this is an illustration. I'm sure that not every subject got to that degree of hyperextension. So you can read, yeah, I mean, you have the full paper. I even translated it for you if you want to see if they mentioned anything about the average range of motion that they got, but I don't believe they did, right? But it's just in that task, the combined forces would be extension and retraction, and these other tasks they would be more depression, right? Now I don't have an actual row to show you in there. I can't conjure up evidence that doesn't exist, but there still is the trend that things where I'm focusing on extension and back are more upper lat, and things that focusing on more depression is lower lat. So even if you don't think these are perfect for a row, right? Okay, this is good for depression, right? Like in that we can see much less upper, a lot more lower, right? To me, that looks fairly biased. Okay. If we look at things that where they didn't measure multiple, but we look at the relationship between the sensor placement and whether or not it still trends with, hey, did they get higher amplitude in the upper lats doing extension or retraction things versus more lower lat and depression things? There's the Lehman study. They got higher amplitude in retractions than they did in pull downs for the upper lats. Basically, it was 1 centimeter below the inferior tip of the or the inferior tip of the scapula, right? In the Edelberg manuscript, they basically were a lot lower, I think 4 centimeters below. Okay. And they actually found that vertical pulling was then more prominent in terms of amplitude, particularly with pull downs, or not pull downs, but pull ups. Okay. So also trends. The Park study, high amplitude in extension versus pull downs, in the upper back depressions, same thing. In the Ito study, lower lats had higher activation in depression exercises, you know, and just I know you're not going to like this, right? Because this is my lab or whatever, but we just did some depressions versus some retractions with a similar relative effort. You can see the ratio upper lat is at the bottom, lower lat is at the top in green, right? And you can look at the ratio change between those two conditions. To me, that's pretty substantial, right? Like in the depression, the upper lap's hovering around 50%. All right, in the retraction, right, we're getting over 100% on some of these, right? If we look at the range of motion component, okay, we have the upper lats have the smallest change in motion with trunk motion. The lower lats gain significant stretch with positioning of trunk motion. That includes both basically rotation and lateral bending, but more for the lateral bend in terms of the lower lats. Okay, so we can see that basically we can affect the range of motion of these relative portions of the lat very differently with how we position the trunk. Okay, we saw the same evidence in the Gerling study, which basically used fascicle lengths or estimating to estimate sarcomere length changes, right? And they came up with the same conclusions that the lower lats are going to get a substantial length change in lateral bending and also more on rotation relative to the upper portion of the lats. In the modeling that we've done, same thing. We see that basically in the lower lats, we can get more range of motion increase with humeral elevation and depression than we can with the upper lats, but the upper lats we get significantly more in protraction and retraction. And then we also see the same thing in terms of the trunk. This is both with trying to do, simulation modeling with like, we'll say like a replicated skeleton with the quotum rubber bands, and also measuring regular humans and trying to trace the muscles. We see the same correlation that we do on the other studies. So there is an ability to influence the range of motion and length tension relationship of those muscles differently. Okay. When we look at leverage and the specificity argument, okay, glenohumeral, I don't think there's a big difference between the upper and lower lats. And also there tends to be this thing where they can kind of like, okay, as in a row motion, the lower lats may have better leverage to start to do the glenohumeral, like the extension, but as they lose it, the upper lats gain. So if we're looking at means across, we're going to see that like, okay, we're getting similar average. And there's also usually like pass off sometimes where one's stronger at glenohumeral action, the other stronger at sternoclavicular. So I think of the differences between those, the glenohumeral is the least, which is why I don't think if you're trying to bias them that the trick would be switching between sagittal and frontal plane, but really going from vertical or horizontal, right? So at the sternoclavicular, I think the upper lats have a greater mechanical advantage towards retraction relative to the lower lats that have a greater mechanical advantage towards depression. Okay.
Okay. Cass, real quick. We have 15
Yes.
minutes left, and I think Elle has a question.
Okay. I only have two more slides, but go ahead.
Could I see the videos from your lab again, please?
Yep.
You guys went through the entire exercise, or did you just do that top part?
Well, I was just, in this experiment, it was just to show the difference between depression and retraction in isolation,
So when there's
right?
other muscles that play a role in scapular depression, as I said, and there's only like a few muscle fibers that are even attached to the scapula, directly moving the scapula, what exactly, like, how do you know that it's the differences between the lats having better leverage, quote unquote, for the scapula if they don't even directly move the bone? It's
I
just,
guess the lats are just active here because they're happy to be there.
and you don't know that there's also other muscles that could be involved. I don't know, stabilizing
I
the
mean,
movement. So if your arms all the way up above your head, I'm sure your obliques are going to be somewhat active at
well,
least.
see, I actually took and I placed the sensor in a place where it wouldn't be over the oblique specifically for that objection.
Okay,
So
oblique.
if you can see that, but I mean, I tried to eliminate as much of that crossover. If you want to just be like, if you just want to throw out all the EMG data and just be like, we don't like, let's just use none of it because we have no idea other muscles are not involved, whatever, right? I'm doing my best to be transparent of like, hey, this is evidence that I'm using to come up with my conclusion. If you just want to be
Well,
like, no,
well, I'm
it,
also drawing conclusions from across different data sets. So other muscles, like for example, the deltoids, they are quite literally like not active at all versus really, really active.
if
So when
you want to ask me if I think the lats can be separated up or lower the same way that anterior and posterior delts can, I would say no. You can't separate them to that degree, right? You
how
can
is it
like,
relevant?
what'd you say?
So then how is any of this clinically relevant if whether you do, let's say, an upper, like the upper bias
You're
lat row versus the lower bias lat row, it's not like you're only going to grow the upper lat versus the lower lat. Why not
I
just,
do th I do think you can still get a relative stimulus difference, right? So if one portion of the region is more active, right, that doesn't mean the stimulus is not going to be even throughout the whole muscle, even though there's not one part of the muscle that's 100% active and another part of the muscle that's 0% active. We don't even see that in complete antagonist relationships. Like if
well,
I do
yeah,
a
no
bicep
kidding,
curl,
relax.
my triceps recruit a little bit. That doesn't mean that the triceps also grow during bicep curls. So all I'm
Yeah, no
saying here
kidding. Because
is that I think there's a different enough stimulus to provide a difference
yeah,
clinically.
Well, the only issue is that no kidding, the lats are going to have a quote unquote difference. They're thin. So if you put electrodes over them, they're going to catch noise from underneath. Even with the rectus femoris, I could actually show you this. You see noise in, like, let's say a leg press, where even though there's like slightly less activation of the rectus femoris during a leg press or a squatting pattern, you still see that there is quite a bit, and that wouldn't necessarily make sense by the logic of antagonist inhibition, where if you are trying to do, you're trying to stretch and contract your rectus femoris at the same time, there would be less activation. However, because of the noise from underneath the muscle, like the vastus intermedius, we see that there is still some activation, some good activation there too. Not to mention, there's like different actual points in the movement, as you said before. Like, there's another reason why we need isokinetic exercises as well. And yes, we don't have enough data on that. But all that being said, like, the lats are thin, they're very susceptible to noise contamination. So what exactly did you do here to?
Braden, can I get a vote in here? Do you think those hypertrophied lats there are at least a little thicker than probably most of what is in the studies? I
Um,
chose I chose this individual intentionally so that we could have some really thick lats.
Okay, well, the upper lat is always going to be smaller than the lower lat because that's just how the muscle is structured. It's a
In
convergent muscle.
thinness,
How exactly are you looking at thinness? Are you literally cutting him open and then measuring it? Do you have an
I'm
MRI
asking
machine over
you.
there?
You were the one that said it's always smaller. I'm asking in what context.
No, I'm talking about that the muscle is relatively thin compared to other muscles, and also the fact that when we're talking about the muscles underneath the lat, it still is susceptible to noise contamination. And you can't deny that because the rectus femoris is.
Ella, where is this criticism on all of the other EMG studies that you referenced as strong evidence?
Because the way that I referenced it was not in the sense that I'm looking at statistical significance, but I'm comparing those studies as evidence that there is not a clinically significant difference between the two. So the difference between clinically relevant and statistical significance is pretty big. If something is clinically relevant, it means that if you don't do these two lat exercises, then the lower lats are going to freaking atrophy. That's not how we see it.
we have
That's
10 minutes left.
that is a scale that I would disagree with. I don't think significance is if you don't do this thing, it will atrophy. I think
I agree with
significance
the whole of the
is
scientific community.
if you do one thing, you can actually get a change of like we'll say a visible change with application. And I've have tons and tons of real world examples where people have actually changed the relationship of how much lower lat to upper lat they appear to have in their physique, like
And how did you
visible
know that? Did
changes.
you take MRIs? What was the difference? What was the effect size?
The
Because
difference was what was mattered, which is their lower lats looked bigger on stage and looked like they grew disproportionately to
so
their
you
upper
don't have any
lats.
actual
So
data.
I would say if you can visibly see it, I mean, what is the clinic for if you're training for hypertrophy? What is the clinic in which we are applying significance? Is it in an MRI
Um,
machine
Can we agree
or
that
is
the
it
lower
in the
lat?
mirror? Is it on the bodybuilding stage?
Can we agree that
Where's
the
the
lower lat that it can we agree that the lower lat is always going to be bigger than the upper lat in the sense that it is quite literally a converging muscle and it's a triangle. So the base of the triangle is always going to be bigger than the upper part. Please give me an example where the person grew their upper lat to the extent that it was bigger than the lower lat. I'd love to see it because that's what I'm talking about with clinical relevance. Because it's not just about, oh, you gained like maybe 5 grams of muscle tissue on your lower lat. Is that really clinically relevant? No. If somebody has like an injury on one of the muscles that plays a really big role in, let's say, your upper biased exercises, are you literally going to say, oh, well, if you do this one type of exercise, then one part of your lat is not going to grow? Because that's not clinical
this
relevant.
if you let me finish, you'll find that my claim is softer than that, right? My clinical references is like, can I actually make somebody's physique look different? Because that's ultimately why they're choosing to do these
Oh, no,
exercises.
it's not genetics.
So, well, because they had the same genetics before.
Epigenetics. Environment affects your genetics. So what is your point? If you give people steroids and they grow their lower lat a little bit more, how do you know it wasn't the
All
steroid?
right. F you for
So,
that cope.
so I'm
Oh,
pretty
it's
certain.
fine.
So this is where we're at the burden of proof. Okay. Cass has made, so you've made the claim that the lower lats cannot be biased. Cass's claim is that they can be biased, and the burden of proof falls on Cass. His subjects that he showed in his evidence, they're all natural, I'm assuming, Cass?
Those were this one is not, but I'm not. This is not a before and after, right?
Yeah, the before and afters I'm referencing, those are all natural
Yeah.
individuals. So
Yes,
the
yes,
the
those are
claim of
natural
steroids,
individuals.
the
And I
claim
made
that
that
steroids is
claim.
not viable.
I mean, I would also argue that depending on someone, like epigenetics are affected by someone's diet, how much body fat they gained. Moreover, I would argue that the type of evidence that I'm
Where are we going with the conversation, right? Like the
because
goal
we're
of this
looking for
conversation
clinical
is to talk
relevance.
about whether or not we can do two different exercises. Why are we talking about epigenetics?
Because you're arguing that it's clinically relevant, and I'm arguing that it's not. I'm saying that you can do the two lat exercises that you enjoy, and the main
I'm
reason that
appealing
you
to the
probably
moderator here.
do it, the reason why you probably should do two different types of lat exercises is because there's different muscles involved around the shoulder girdle. You have your rear delts, which are going to play more of a role in a row than a lat pull down. So it's not about biasing different parts of the lats for me because I don't think that's clinically relevant. If I'm talking to a client and they're like, "Hey, I really, really hate lat rows. They make my shoulders hurt for whatever reason."
What
But I
you
love
we're
lat pull downs.
I think we're completely off the topic here. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that, hey, if a client doesn't like pull downs, they have to do pull downs or they'll get
We're
no
arguing about
lats.
clinical relevance, are we not? Or we're
So
arguing about whether you see a difference, are we not?
that's not that we I think we just established that, the burden of proof is on me, but like my relevance for clinical difference is, can I make a difference aesthetically? You went from MRI to now I have a client that doesn't
You have
want to
to,
do pull downs. I don't understand how
because
going
you have
like
multiple
working around
independent
injuries and
variables
stuff
here
now
that are
is
all confounding. You have multiple independent variables here. You have diet, lifestyle, cardio, exercise. You have different exercises. All of these things. Oh,
off topic,
no, it's not.
right?
How many of those variables were already accounted for with
Yeah.
the subjects that Cass used?
But
Were they not eating and training the exact same? Was everything accounted for with the visible difference in the lower lats on his
But
subjects?
when we're talking about clinical relevance, I'm talking about like the exercise has to quite literally show a very marked change. Let's say the upper lats, because it is a converging muscle, grows significantly more than the lower lats. I still have yet to see any evidence of this.
okay. Well, I would argue that the examples that I presented are that, and those people would too. For them, it's clinically relevant. So, I mean, if the people using the techniques are defining it as clinically relevant to them in terms of how they see the change in their physique, applying to stuff in the real world, that's ultimately what I define as clinically relevant. Right now,
Look, if you enjoy yoga, that's
I
fine.
don't do
Go for
ultrasounds
it.
or MRIs on these people, before and after, right? But when these people are getting peeled for stage and they see a difference in their physique, like it's visible. I mean, I don't know how, like, you can get changes that are significant on ultrasound or MRI, but aren't that visibly impressive. Like the threshold to actually have a visible change in your physique is significantly higher, right? I mean,
Do you think that it's
Braydon,
clinically relevant
you're a physique competitor,
now,
like, and
do you think it's clinically relevant to do a shoulder exercise that targets the front delts and the rear delts? Do you think
yes,
your physique would suffer? Okay, do you think your physique would suffer if, let's say, you chose to only do your quote unquote upper lat biased row versus your lower lat?
I think that yes, you would get less lower lat hypertrophy than if you did both.
You have no evidence of it. It's all anecdote, all of it.
And yes,
Anecdote and
that is
incorrect math,
true.
by
The
the way.
evidence we have is the observational evidence here. Like the
Anecdote and
hypertrophy doesn't
incorrect math.
exist, right? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah, but it's sure as hell not proving your case any harder than it was before, so.
I don't seem to remember saying that I had strong evidence. In fact, I think my critique was is
The
that
one you
you
said
were
that I was
claiming you
being
had strong
dishonest.
evidence.
So the issue that I have is you were calling me dishonest. Now, you said,
Okay, I think you are dishonest, and I would like to actually play a clip regarding that.
oh, hold up.
Uh,
Before you play a clip, before you play a clip, I have a little slide that I prepared just for you.
okay.
There is a difference between unfair, incorrect, and dishonest interpretations. An unfair interpretation is based on your opinion of how you view the literature. You disagree with someone else's interpretation. This is something that I've seen with you in the sense that you like to interpret studies study by study by study. You don't really interpret in between studies, and that's just a little different from me. I like to interpret studies based off of how clinically relevant does it look based off of other studies that have demonstrated clinical relevance because I value clinical relevance over some arbitrary statistically significant number. Now, an incorrect
False.
interpretation, that's your opinion. As I said, it's an unfair interpretation. I believe yours is unfair, you believe mine is unfair. That's fine. Incorrect interpretations is using a model how it's not supposed to be used to draw an arbitrary moment arm without accounting for reaction forces and coupling effects, and then trying to use that as some sort of strong evidence for saying that the lats can be biased. That's an incorrect interpretation.
I never said any of the evidence was strong. I said it was all weak,
That's still it's still an incorrect interpretation of
right?
how you use that because the
I,
math
I I didn't put up a comparison of two different, things that weren't meant to be compared and claim it as strong evidence,
the math was still wrong.
right?
The whole point is that the math was still wrong. No matter how you put it, the math was still wrong. Now, as for dishonest interpretations, this implies deceptiveness. So reporting the incorrect moment arm despite knowing it's wrong, I don't believe you did that. And reporting a study that said they found a 50% activation when in reality was a completely 0% activation. I still did not do that. I didn't report that there was a specific number of activation and then report some other number that was completely different. I didn't report that. I just said that it was similar. Okay. And then now, as far as like talking
You
about,
you said the exact same. I have screenshots of it. You
okay,
said
if that's
they're the exact same.
I said it
I
wrong, then
believe the
I said it
exact same is
wrong.
the same.
Okay, then I
Okay.
said it wrong. And you know what? I'm also happy to acknowledge when I am wrong. That's another thing, which you still have yet to acknowledge that you incorrectly you incorrectly calculated the moment arm for what you were trying to use it for. And that said, if we're talking about potential dishonesty, the subjective interpretation of what is clinically relevant in the literature, like EMG data, which tends to have a really large margin of error,
Braden, I would like to make sure I have time to cover
that's
that clip. I don't
I'm
know how
almost
much
done.
is remaining.
I'm almost done.
Okay.
I'm almost done. That's very unlikely to be potentially dishonest because scientists do that all the time. They interpret things from across vast bodies of literature, drawing conclusions that maybe the authors themselves didn't draw because they don't believe it's clinically relevant. Now, what I would argue is that it's more potentially dishonest by saying that, oh yeah, well, this moment arm is supposed to show that there's better leverage at the sternoclavicular than the glenohumeral joint when you're not accounting for literally all of the joints in between that have a very big impact on the whole system. And considering you know quite a bit about biomechanics, I'm surprised you didn't account for it.
Yeah, I would say the amount that I know about biomechanics is why I was okay with looking at this in a much more simple lens, also understanding who and where I was communicating that information. Um,
Clearly, every single professor and professional in the field of biomechanics would disagree with you.
yes, I would think your professors would agree that teaching advanced biomechanical models on Instagram is
No, you used
probably
the
not
biomechanical model to debate me. You used it to debate me on the lats being biased. You didn't use it just as education to show what a moment arm looks like. That's not what you used it for. You used it for the specific purpose of saying the lats can be biased. That's
in.
incorrect.
Are you referring to my post or the previous? Let's just move on. All right. Um, so I knew kind of coming into this that this wasn't probably going to be a quote unquote debate about whether or not the lats could be biased, and it was more so going to be a response to how poorly the first portion of the debate went. Um, and so I expected it not to be as amicable and more to be like, oh, look, you did this, you said this or whatever. And, you know, I tried, can I just please don't interrupt me for a second. I let you kind of go through most of your thing. Um, I tried to be very considerate during the first one and not be like, hey, you're saying this. That's not true. That's not representative of what you said. And, part of me was just like, should I have pointed those things out? Right. And so since you have made a lot of claims on like I do that, like the way that I look at stuff or whatever, that I just think is just blatant lies or mischaracterizations. I would like to present some evidence from the first debate in your videos. Would you like to play the video, Braden, or would you like me to? Right.
You're talking
Um,
about the live.
So there's two in there, but we can start with the thing on the lat insertion. Like
I
so
already admitted that that was wrong. Like
you
I'm
admitted it was wrong, but
talk about things that are
you
being
lied
wrong.
about the use of it, right? And whatnot, right? So I would like to play what you said.
Okay, a
Relative.
mistake does not equal a lie. Just so you know, like I corrected my mistake. I said that I was wrong. And now you're just kind of going back and trying to show more videos of me saying random things. Like I've already said, like I'm more than happy to correct myself when I'm wrong. You're not happy to correct yourself when you're wrong for not using the data correctly. So now you're just trying to defame my character to prove a point. What's the point here?
It's a demonstration of
I
your
didn't lie and
honesty
say
based off of
mistake,
what you said. All
but
right,
it's
well,
not a lie.
the
It's a
evidence
mistake.
should exonerate you then, right?
Me
Can
saying,
we play it?
"Oh, are you going to play the entire clip where at the very end I literally say, 'Hey, I was wrong about this,' or are we just going to skip over that part from the last debate where I literally
So,
admit, 'Hey, I'm wrong'?"
well, I only have the recording as long as it went, but it clearly doesn't seem you
The
said
recording was
it was a
9 minutes.
misspeak, right? You didn't say I was wrong. You said it was a misspeak.
Okay, then
Okay.
I was
And
wrong.
then and then you
Okay, I'm
said
wrong.
that you corrected it because you talked to your partner and there's evidence of both of you making this claim after that would have happened, right? And you're doing this and you're
Okay, so I
describing
can't
so
correct
I
myself. So I can't correct myself not only after the live, but I can't correct myself maybe a few days after the live. It has to be exactly after the live.
no,
Me.
it's just showing that basically the way you represented yourself during our debate was dishonest, right? Because you're like, oh, that was a misspeak. And it wasn't. You clearly thought that the lower lats inserted on the upper lats, and you were using that as a strong
No,
reason
I
for your
misspoke.
opinion. If
No,
you
no,
miss,
during that part, I did misspeak. And misspeaks are mistakes. Making mistakes is okay. I'm more than happy to admit when I'm wrong. Clearly, you're not.
all right, I I find it very unlikely.
How is it a misspeak when the same claim is regurgitated several times
Because I can
over a span of multiple videos?
So typically when I get something in my head about how I'm going to say something, I'll say it over and over again because I don't know how to reformulate that thought. Then again, whenever I get caught in an actual mistake, I'm happy to admit it. So yeah, misspeaks are mistakes. I may have thought that at the time, and then that ended up catching on over the course of the next few days. But either which ways, I'm happy
Now,
to admit that was a mistake. Even if
if
like
it's a
it wasn't a mistake
misspeak,
or if it was a mistake, I don't fucking care.
if
It's
it's a
a mistake.
misspeak, can you build a rationale behind that misspeak?
Well, either which ways, the lats still they still attach to the humerus. So both parts of the lats, the lower and the upper lats, still attach to the humerus. So what is your point
Yeah,
there?
I'm not saying this is relevant to the lat discussion.
Yeah, it's not
I'm
relevant at
just
all.
saying that I think you lied to me and I think you just lied during the debate and
No, they
saying that it was a
converge around each
misspeak,
other. They converge
right?
around each other and they attach at the humerus. So me saying that that's a misspeak or having a mistake, I don't fucking care what you call it. It's still a mistake. I can still apologize for it. And that doesn't take away from the fact that you still have not acknowledged that you use the moment arm, the entire like mathematics behind it, incorrectly. Very incorrectly.
I mean, I don't know how differently you want me to put it, right? I think there's a
Oversimplify it,
context where, yes,
represent
that is, we'll say, acceptable. And then there's also a degree of accuracy, which it does not
No, 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 no,
cover.
no. This is okay. At this point, it's just getting to be a very lame excuse and attempts to try to discredit me for being wrong and literally admitting to it. When I quite literally destroyed your entire like internal moment arm leverage BS that was clearly wrong. So like I honestly you can just I mean you can own up to it like I did.
Okay. Well, I don't share your view of how or the context of which that was wrong, right? I do share
Well,
your
you're not in my
view
brain, so
that it
how do you
doesn't
know?
fit. All right. Well, I guess I've already said my opinion. I don't know how many more times I can say that. Cool. I'm
Just
not
because you don't share the
accepting
same view
the
doesn't mean
degree
I'm
of
lying.
wrongness on that you want me to. Okay.
Okay, just because you don't
Right.
share the same view and just because you think I'm lying doesn't mean I actually am. Doesn't mean I had a deceptive intent behind saying that.
That's why I wanted to play the video,
Yeah, which one do you want to
right?
play real quick?
So there's a lat that says lat insertion.
Considering
on
I'm
there.
willing to admit that this was a mistake, like honestly, I don't see the point in playing
Well,
this.
one of the biggest critiques from people that watched the first debate was calling it a misspeak, given not only how many times you said,
Then I'll just
but the
call it a mistake.
context in which you said it, right?
Dude, I'm
So,
fine calling it a mistake, but clearly you're not able to acknowledge your own mistake. I've said this like 30 fucking times.
okay, cool. I
So I'll
like
just
I
call it
believe
a
it was a
mistake.
mistake, right?
All
I
right.
don't understand why you didn't
I don't
say
care.
that in the debate and why you acted like, well, I just mixed up my words and I misspoke. When in reality, it's like, no, I was probably wrong about this and I'm correcting my position.
Okay, so now you're literally just trying to drag this entire conversation when I just admitted multiple times, hey, it's a mistake. Misspeak, mistake, I don't give a fuck. Like, why can't you just ex admit you're wrong about the moment arms? Why do you have to pivot it back onto me? Why do you have to like use me and like try to attack my
This
character
is I'm not saying well
saying that I'm lying?
because you were saying
You have
how I
no evidence
interpreted the
of that.
research. If you want to say that my math is wrong, that's fine. Okay. And if you want to not like my response to that, that's also fine.
You can
Okay.
think I'm lying, but that doesn't mean I am because it doesn't mean I have deceptive intent behind it. I'm not making money off saying that the lower lats insert on the upper lats. I've never made
Yeah.
money off of that claim. So why is this a big
I mean,
deal?
another example was like for the external rotation thing, where in the debate you acted like, well, I don't, highlight that study over the other ones. And if we actually count how many times you reference that, it's equal or more than the other studies you referenced,
Now
right?
you're
So,
counting how many times that I pull up one of the studies that I pulled up probably 5 times over the
well, it
past
wasn't very
year
hard
for
because I just watched the
1
videos and I
second.
just knew how much it came up, right? So I'm just saying that,
For someone who's so big on the truth, you seem to have a really hard time actually acknowledging that you were wrong about something that was oversimplified.
yeah, I would say it was, that is a very simplified way of looking at it, but that's the exact intent that it was meant to be, was a very simplified look.
Simplified look that was wrong in the
Okay.
context of being clinically relevant.
Yeah.
It was just
If
wrong.
and
Just admit that it's wrong.
if you want to pursue finding a model that is more advanced that then shows that
Maybe
that is very wrong,
model since it would prove
then
your
do
point
it.
apparently.
So by all means, like
So I
I
don't think that this is any longer a debate. And I'm pretty sure we've gone over the hour. So if you guys want to end it, I don't really see a point in continuing this.
so I would like to just finish my explanation, which was like at two more slides. It's a horrible like cut of just like here's what I think because I we were supposed to get to practical applications and we never did, right?
We're not going to have
So
time for practical applications. I will let you finish your statement, and then I think we'll call it.
okay. Okay. So I think I'm here. My clinical observation is basically no one has ever come to me for help with underdeveloped upper lats. Now that's not respective to their actual size, but just how that size fits their physique. But the opposite is quite a common occurrence, right? This aligns with the trends and evidence that most traditional training methods would favor the upper lats. Okay, and that's looking at a variety of things, and then also then the overlap we get from other exercises because when we look at things we're doing for the upper back, even for the lower body, RDLs, deadlifts, etc., we are working that kind of protraction, retraction action in those, and then there's similarities between upper back and upper lat movements as well. Everything's more similar, right? By incorporating technique that emphasize depression, trunk positions to train the lower lats at different muscle lengths, I've observed this muscle balance go from a weakness to balance or even a strength. I even have examples where people have essentially had to limit their lat training because now their lower lats, their iliac lats are becoming too prominent for their physique goal, right? This observation, right, seems consistent with my analysis of the biomechanics, even though it's a very simplified one in this context, right, of back training and limited evidence we have. Okay, so people can pause this if they want, but basically this would be my practical applications in terms of strategies. If you don't want to give me the time to read through it, I'll just be quiet.
Okay, great. We'll pause that so people can watch it. Okay. Any final remarks from either one of you?
Nope.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming on. Uh, like and subscribe. We'll call it there.
All right. Have a good rest of your day, guys.
Okay, see ya.